and we start a great topic. I hope that we will finish this topic today. If not, we will continue. It will be relations China with USSR, which already we spoke here, but how it's changed to make links with this Chinese with U.S. imperialism, with Nixon and all this
and so on.
politics in 1970s.
Yes. So yes, it's a very first we have to talk about the historical background. So we have to take into account the fact that the Chinese Communist Party from the very beginning developed along a line which was based on, let's say, Chinese realities. And this led, especially in the 30s, to some differences, let's say, ideological and methodological differences between the Chinese Communist Party, especially under Mao Zedong, and the Soviet Communist Party. Because the Soviet Union was rather in favor of helping China against imperialism, not taking into account the situation of communists and pushing them to an alliance with the Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang government, who killed quite a lot of mass of communists. In the same time, the communists did manage to realize that united front line against Japan, but of course on a quite different method than the Soviet would have done. The second thing that created a difference, let's say, between the Soviets and China was after the Second World War. Soviet army occupied the liberated from Japanese Northeast China, what was called at that time under Japanese occupation the Manchuria, and they were of course recognizing the legal Chinese government of the Kuomintang, and when they retreated from Northeast China, they gave the power to Chiang Kai-shek troops, and even the arms they took from Japanese to the Kuomintang. And, communists were not very happy with that because the civil war was beginning. And to a certain extent, it looked that the Soviet preferred Kuomintang to communists. And at the very beginning of the civil war, Stalin told he didn't know the reality on the ground in China, so he was supposing, I guess, that Kuomintang was stronger than it was and that communists were weaker than they were. So he advised communists not to launch a civil war to trying to take power. So the communists did not hear what Stalin told them, and they began the civil war. And as we know, they win. But to the very end, the Soviet Union was convinced that Chiang Kai-shek was stronger than he was, and the Soviet Union recognized very, very late the Kuomintang government, and recognized very late Chinese People's Republic. But in spite of all that, what I told, the Chinese communists and Mao Zedong especially were having differences with Soviet Union, but still they recognized the importance of Soviet Union, and even they recognized the importance of Stalin as an ideological leader. If we look at Mao Zedong writings, his quotation of Stalin are most of the time much more. There are much more a quotation of Stalin than Marx or Lenin even. which shows that Stalin was considered by Chinese communists as a very important leader, in spite of the difference I told you about. And so when People's Republic was founded, Mao Zedong went to Moscow. He was there for a very long time, because more than 1 month. He negotiated with Soviet cooperation. It was quite difficult, because it was the time of the Yugoslav-Soviet split. And in Soviet Union, in the Soviet leadership, there was quite a strong tendency to have to suppose that communists who did arrive to power without Soviet help could go the Tito way. So Mao Zedong has to convince him he was a real communist and he was a real pro-Soviet and ally of Soviet Union. Anyway, it worked. And the cooperation between Soviet Union and China began for 10 years, more or less, so from the beginning of the 50s up to 1960. In 1956, the beginning of the split between Soviet Union and China began for different reasons. For ideological reason, but also for difference of behavior. Since for Chinese, the Soviet advisor in China were very helpful, and this is a fact they never denied, but they were sometimes tensions, since the way the Soviet behaved was observed by a lot of Chinese as arrogant and not taking into account the Chinese realities, the Chinese mentalities, and so on and so on. But that was, of course, not enough to split. The second reason of split was the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of Soviet Union, because at that time Soviet Union decided under Khrushchev that there will be the so-called peaceful coexistence, and it means a good improvement of relation with United States. And as we know, China was just finishing its war, its participation in the Korean War with North Korea, and a part of the Chinese territory, Taiwan, was still not liberated. And as you know, China was not admitted to the United Nations up to 1971. So because of all these reasons, Chinese felt that to a certain extent the 20th Congress of the Communist Party was a betraying of their interest on one side, and on the other side, they couldn't accept the systematic critics made against Stalin, since Mao Zedong, even if he had differences with Stalin, as I told you earlier, considered that Stalin basically was a prominent anti-imperialist leader and a great thinker, and that it cannot be erased by somebody like Khrushchev, who did nothing for ideology, for Marxist ideology, and who was just opportunistic. So because of that, tension began between China and Soviet Union, and they led 4 years later to the official split between China and Soviet Union on the ideological line that Soviet Union became a revisionistic state, that it's going to rebuild capitalism, and that Soviet Union is changing from a socialist country to a capitalist country. That was the point of view of China in the middle of the 60s, that Soviet Union was not anymore a socialist country. It was a capitalist country, a state capitalist country, but the leadership of Soviet Union was ideologically considered by the Chinese as a bourgeois leadership and not as a proletarian one. And because of that, this argumentation was very much used during the so-called Cultural Revolution, because the split we had inside Communist Party of China were officially explained that they were carrying a class war against Khrushchev-type revisionists in China, and especially against the former president of the Republic of China, Liu Shaoqi, who was called the Chinese Khrushchev. And that was the official line of the Chinese Communist Party, excuse me, up to the, I have to and that was the official line of the Communist Party up to 1976. That there is a class struggle within socialist countries, and we have the same type of class struggle in Soviet Union as in China. In Soviet Union, the revolutionaries, the proletariat, was defeated by Khrushchev bourgeois line. In China, the proletariat win due to the Cultural Revolution, and the Chinese Khrushchev was defeated. That was the internal Chinese policy, and at that time we had very tough relations between Soviet Union and China, since we had even a little war at the border of China in 1970. In 1969, the Soviet army occupied islands on the Amur River, on the Ussuri River, in fact, which were considered by the Soviets as Soviet, and which were considered by the Chinese as Chinese, since they were on the Chinese side of the river and not on the Soviet side of the river. The Soviet Union had a very strange theory at that time that the whole river up to the shore are belonging to Soviet Union and not the frontier. The border is not in the middle of the river. So they occupied these islands which were on the Chinese side of the border, and of course there were fights between Soviet army and Chinese army. Now the problem has been solved, since nowadays Russia recognized the Chinese point of view and gave back these islands to China. So now they recognize that the Soviet Union at the Brezhnev time were wrong, and that Soviet Union occupied illegally some part of the Chinese territory, and provoked Chinese army and People's China. And we have to take into account that in socialist countries linked with Soviet Union, we had a huge anti-Chinese campaign, which was partly ideologically, it means Soviet Union pretended that China was a petit bourgeois nationalist country and not a real socialist country. And Mao Zedong answered to that, Soviet pretend we are petit bourgeois, we are pretending Soviet Union are bourgeois. So we are on the left of them, even in the sphere of propaganda. But the difference between Soviet Union and China created a split within socialist countries. Some socialist country went on the side of one. In fact, socialist country went on the side of China. It means Albania. Some socialist country tried to be neutral, like North Vietnam at the time, North Korea, and Romania. And some countries were tough on the line of pro-Soviet line, like German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. Poland was trying to maintain good relation with China under Gomułka, and under Gierek, Poland went on the Soviet side in a very decisive way. And of course, the same situation occurred in communist parties all over the world. Some parties, the majority of the parties went on the Soviet side, some went on the Chinese side, and where there were parties going on the Soviet side, the Chinese promoted local split parties. Which were called Communist Marxist-Leninist Party, fighting against the mainstream, let's say, Communist Party, which was on the Soviet side. So we had all over the world the split between China and Soviet Union, and then we had a strategical problem with China because Soviet Union was encircling, in fact, China, because if you look at the map, the all northeastern and northwestern border of China were Soviet or Soviet controlled in Mongolia. If you go in the south, India was on the side of Soviet Union, and Vietnam was not sure if it was on the side of China or on the side of Soviet Union. So the Chinese army was more and more persuaded that the main enemy, the main strategical, the main threat to China is not coming from the United States, which are just occupying Taiwan and South Korea, but all other frontiers, all of the border, with very little exceptions, were under Soviet influence. And China felt that the danger at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, China began to feel that the main threat is not coming from United States, but from a Soviet army. And as I told you, the military tensions at the border between China and the Soviet Union in 1969 created this mood. And from that time, the Soviet leadership was called in Chinese propaganda the new Tsars. That the government of Soviet Union has become a new Tsarist government, which is expanding in Asia and trying to liquidate Chinese independence. And this was, of course, very important, especially because in China, I told you about the Cultural Revolution, inside China, we had a strong split between the ones who were radically in favor of the Cultural Revolution, and the ones who were rather tending to make some compromise, recognizing Mao Zedong's still power, but trying to make compromise. And the later history will show that they will win after the death of Mao. But why I'm talking about that, because let's say ultra left tendencies in China were concentrated on internal policies, on fights against their competitors or their enemies inside the party, and this, of course, existed till the end of the so-called Gang of Four in 1976. But in the same time, this fraction in the party was not really engaged in the foreign policy. The foreign policy was rather controlled by traditional diplomats who were rather, let's say, state-oriented or patriotically oriented or nationalistically oriented, as you want, but who were not really very concerned by ideological questions. They were rather looking at the world on the on the side of geostrategy, geopolitics, and they were more and more convinced that Soviet Union was the main threat to China's independence rather than United States. And of course, it was possible due to the fact that the Americans were at that time defeated in Vietnam, and the Chinese, and especially the Chinese diplomat, concluded from that United States are a decaying force, which whom it will be possible to negotiate when Soviet Union is a rising force, which will be more and more arrogant. And at the time, they developed the theory of the so-called social imperialism. It means that basing on two sentences from Mao Zedong, really true sentences of Mao Zedong, which was already very sick and not very engaged in all that, but basing on these two sentences, they developed the so-called theory of three worlds. It means that there was supposed to be an imperialist world, which was based on two superpowers, United States and Soviet Union, which were equally imperialist. The only difference that were that the United States were supposed to be normal capitalist imperialists, when Soviet Union gave the appearance of what they call the social imperialism. Then you had the supposed second world. It means developed countries from the East and West. It means, according to this theory, let's say France, England, Poland, Bulgaria, Canada were all belonging to the second world, in spite of the fact that one were on the Soviet side and the other ones were on the American ones. And then you had the real revolutionary in the South, which was the so-called third world, which was regrouping socialist countries of the South, revolutionary, let's say, countries of the South, but also, to a large extent, newly independent countries of the South, in spite of the fact that they could have a very reactionary regime, that they could be very linked with one of or another imperialist powers, and so on. So these theories of three worlds was used to justify the fact that China was developing links with all South third world countries, independently from their social orientation. And it happened to be very clear, for example, in 1973, after the Pinochet coup in Chile, they didn't cut relations with Chile. They recognized that Pinochet was the government of Chile, and that the Pinochet coup was an internal affair of Chile, and that basically Chile, even under Pinochet, can become an anti-imperialist country, just as countries where Marxists are supposed to have power. In this situation began the discussion between China and the United States, since the United States were, of course, at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s in a very bad situation due to the Vietnam War. And they tried to negotiate. And the United States negotiated with Soviet Union, they negotiated with China. Nixon had contacts with Brezhnev, had contacts with Mao Zedong. In 1971, Nixon landed in China, in spite of the fact that the United States still at that moment had no diplomatic relation with China, but they began a relation with China at that time, and Soviets on one side and Chinese on the other side were all fearing that the American will go on the side of their competitors. It means Soviets were frightening that United States can support China, and Chinese were afraid that there will be an alliance of United States with Soviet Union against China. And it was not completely false, because on both sides, because in Soviet Union at that time, at the beginning of the 70s, end of 60s, beginning of the 70s, you had quite a lot of Soviet searchers publishing in Soviet, let's say, more or less scientific papers, articles telling that China is a barbaric Asian country and civilized nation, Europeanized nation have to cooperate against China, and that in fact Western Europe and United States are much nearer to Russia than Chinese Asian barbarians. And this point of view created a fear within the Chinese direction, the Chinese leadership, and they began to think that an alliance, a white race alliance of Moscow and Washington is possible against the yellow, so-called at that time in the United States, the yellow peril. And because of that, China began to have, and especially the diplomats of China I told you about earlier, began to have contact with United States. And at that time, Kissinger in the United States began to develop the theory that China is a lesser threat for American imperialism than Soviet Union, because of economical situation of both countries at that time, and that United States can deal with China, and they succeeded, in fact, because from 1971 up to, let's say, the end of the 80s, up to the Gorbachev times, in fact, China, the new leadership of China, especially after the death of Mao, but it began up before the death of Mao Zedong, the Chinese leadership began to cooperate with United States in a lot of issues. Not in all issues, but in a lot of issues in Africa, for example, where they supported a political group who were anti-Soviet, especially, for example, in Angola and in different countries. Of course, they didn't cut their relation with, for example, the Palestinian Revolution and so on. But in quite a lot of countries, they stood on the side of, let's say, more or less pro-American political group or governments against the Soviet ones. And of course, this situation began more and more tough when the Vietnamese did won their revolution in 1975, and at that time Vietnam became more and more on the side of Soviet Union. So the Chinese rather supported the former, let's say, Cambodian revolutionaries, which became the so-called Khmer Rouge, which were for basically nationalistic reason in conflicts with Vietnam. And this led at the very end in 1978-79 to a conflict between China and Vietnam, which was to a large extent the consequences of the conflict between Soviet Union and China. And this situation, of course, was due to the fact that the Chinese leadership, and especially the Chinese leadership under Deng Xiaoping, was convinced that Soviet Union was a rising power and was a rising danger when United States were a decaying one. And this, of course, the history told us it was an error, a basic error, because the United States had still a lot of force, and the Soviet Union was much weaker at the time of Brezhnev, of finishing Brezhnev and later direction of the Soviet Union. And this error, of course, appeared quite clearly in the middle of the 80s. In the middle of the 80s, the Chinese leadership understood that they understood that the Soviet Union was not so strong as they thought, and that the United States were not so weak as they thought. So they began to improve their relation with Gorbachev's Soviet Union, and they then discovered how Gorbachev was pushing his country to degeneration, and at the very end of Soviet Union, we had an official reconciliation of Soviet Union with China, but in the same time, the Chinese leadership in 1989 understood that Gorbachev was leading his country toward chaos, and that China unfortunately helped to make weaker Soviet Union, that they underestimated the force of Soviet Union, and to a certain extent we can assume that China at the end of the 80s made something like a self-critics about their bad estimation of the real balance of power in the world. And because of that, Chinese began to study the reason of why Soviet Union is decaying and then disappearing, and they reacted in a way, of course, completely different than in the Western world, in Eastern Europe, since in 1989, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party was Chao Qiyang, and Chao Qiyang was really the Chinese Gorbachev. He wanted to make out of China a pluri-party system, compared to the United States, exactly like Gorbachev and especially Yeltsin was doing in Soviet Union. And at that time, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party was taken by people who expelled Chao Qiyang from his position in the party and began to refuse for China the way Soviet Union was going under Gorbachev. Of course, it was very late, but still the basic difference was that the Gorbachev perestroika convinced Chinese that the Soviet Union has to be defended and not attacked, but it was of course very too late. because Soviet Union was already dying at that time. But we can say at least that this discovery, I would say, was too late for Soviet Union, but was not too late for China, since in 1989 the Chinese leadership tried to help, for example, East Germany, German Democratic Republic, to survive, and Honecker arrived in Peking, and he tried to build an alliance, which was directed against Gorbachev, in fact, in Moscow. But it was, of course, too late. A German Democratic Republic didn't survive, but China did survive. And from that time, China still cooperated with United States for a quite long period, but without, let's say, the same fascination they had toward the United States, at least at the level of the highest direction of the party. And as we know, the later Chinese leadership became more and more aware that the United States are a strong imperialist country that has to be fought with, because it's a threat to Chinese independence. If now we look at China, interpretation of history now in China, they studied a lot what happened in Soviet Union. They consider still that Khrushchev was a very negative period of history for the communism, because his critics of Stalin were much exaggerated and led Soviet Union toward its decay and its disappearance. So on that side, on that point, they are still holding the line they had in the 50s. But of course, they changed completely their vision of history concerning later Soviet Union. Of course, they considered that Brezhnev Soviet Union was not a country which was building a good socialism, I would say, but still they considered that Soviet Union was a weaker, much weaker state than they thought, and that Chinese leadership overestimated the force of Soviet Union at Brezhnev time and took wrong decisions because of that, in the, let's say, balance between what they thought at that time, both imperialism, but they discovered that Soviet Union, even because of all its negative aspect, was still at that time a more or less socialist country and not a real imperialist country, as they said earlier. But United States, of course, were purely imperialistic, and now they know it. But it was a very tough lesson, not only for Chinese. I think it was a very tough lesson for communists and Marxists and revolutionaries all over the world, that contradiction within socialism are existing, that's for sure, but that the main line of contradictions has to be studied very carefully, and the ultra left or the ultra right deviations are a big threat to the let's say, to the main road towards socialism. Yeah, I don't know if what you have to say about that, if you have questions or what.
Of course, I have a questions. So, firstly, could you tell me if all this conflict between Chinese and the Soviet Union, it was provoked only because of the politic of the Soviet communists and Chinese communists, or we can say that it was provoked by the Western imperialism, and they make a propaganda. I don't know. They push the Chinese communists to this conflict in 1960s. We have proof of that.
No, not really, because in the 60s, Western propaganda was radically anti-Chinese, because at that time we had the theory of convergence. It was the time where this theory was very, very popular in Western universities, in Western elite, and they were thinking, this theory was more or less telling that socialism will evaluate toward more and more so-called liberty. And at the very end, the socialist country will follow the capitalist way, the bourgeois democratic way, and so on and so on. And that Khrushchev is the beginning of that process. So they were rather on the side of Soviet Union, considering that China was ultra communist, destructive with the Cultural Revolution, and that China was becoming barbaric, and so on and so on. So in the 60s, we had all those theories in the Western world that Soviet Union is becoming more and more, let's say, civilized, according, of course, to bourgeois imperialist interpretation, and that more or less, earlier or later, Soviet society will degenerate and become Western-oriented. What happened, in fact? But China is barbaric, not only because they are hardliner at that time communist, but because they are Asian, and this was the so-called theory of the yellow peril, that the Asian race are fanatical, that the Asian race are, let's say, closed to their own behaviors. Of course, it was very easy to develop that in the Western world, because you had the Chinese Revolution, then you had the Korean Revolution, then you had the Vietnamese War, and because all of that, it was quite easy to trying to show in the United States, for example, it was the time when you had, of course, in the United States quite a lot of anti-Soviet film in Hollywood, but you had mostly yellow, anti-communist and simultaneously anti-yellow films. And this was for sure the line to the moment of the Soviet-Chinese fights, as I told you, at the border in 1969. At that time, if you look at the Western media, during the moment where you had the clashes at the Soviet-Chinese border, most of the medias were rather oriented that it's very good that there is a conflict between communists, and it's okay, and we have to be very happy with that, and so on and so on. But the Soviets are civilized, and the Chinese are barbarians. So at the very end, it's better to support Soviet Union because it's going toward civilization, westernization, and so on. The Chinese are not going in that direction. What changed very, very quickly is two events. You had the Lin Piao plot, let's say, in China in 1971. And Lin Piao didn't succeed, as we know, but he tried to escape to Soviet Union. And this was like something like a signal in the West that you have a pro-Soviet faction inside Chinese communist movement, or at least inside the Chinese army, which was not really the case, but it's another thing. And that an eventual reconstruction of the Soviet-Chinese alliance is possible, and that cannot be done. And Kissinger was very clear about that. China and there has to be everything has to be done to maintain the Soviet-Chinese split. And if you want, I mean, logically, if you want to maintain the Chinese-Soviet split, strategically speaking, you cannot be only on one side. It means on the Soviet side against the Chinese. You have to talk with both and to push one against the other. And at that time, the American began to develop indirectly and later, of course, directly contacts with Chinese, telling them, you know, you are a poor country. The American economy is developed, and we can make business. If you help us in Vietnam, for example, if you help us to get out from Vietnam, because the Americans knew that they had to get out from Vietnam, they were trying to do the same with Soviet Union at that time. But if you help us to get out from Vietnam, we can at least begin some business. We know that you have problem with Soviet Union, so be on our side to a certain extent, and we will begin a cooperation. And the Chinese leadership was at that time very conscious that the Chinese economy was still very backward. It was developing, but still very backward. And, you know, the idea that there are some opportunities having contact with a very developed economy was exciting. Quite a lot, let's say, of Chinese leadership engaged in economical field, and this aspect is quite important. And this led to the change of 1971 when Nixon arrived in China. At that time, the change was not so strong as later, because if you read, it's very interesting, if you read the Chinese-American report of the meeting of Mao Zedong and Nixon, the Chinese declaration is very interesting at that time, because China reaffirms that China is considering that we are living in a time of revolution, and revolution will win. In the meantime, we can talk with everybody, but in the same time, China knows that capitalism is finished, and so on and so on, which of course shows two things. First, that at the time the Chinese communists were not wanting to show to the world that they are that when they are talking with Nixon, they want to accept his ideology. But of course, it shows also that the Chinese communists at the time overestimated the force of communism at the time and the weakness of United States. And of course, this error of analyzing the balance of power led to decisions that were later considered even in China as error, because they underestimated the force of the United States. But the United States, you know, at that time, the United States were not the Trump or Biden United States we know now. I mean, the United States at the time of Kissinger and Brzezinski and so on were still a very strong country, and a country able to understand the world as it is, so able also to exploit the contradictions between Soviet Union and China, which is not the case of the United States actually, because the actual elite of the United States are quite blind in their analysis of the world situation. But at that time, they were not so blind. They were quite clever. Of course, it's not sympathetic for us, but we have to understand they were quite realistic, and they were giving something to Soviets, proposing some things to Chinese, later proposing something to the Vietnamese, even if they defeated them, and so on and so on. And they could quite in a quite intelligent way push one against the other and use both sides. And the Soviet-Chinese split is a very complicated thing because both sides made tremendous errors, and both sides didn't really understood what was happening on the other side. At the time, I remember I was in Poland in the 70s, and I was, militant in different organization, foreign affairs of student organization of the Polish Union, and I had deal with a lot of people from different socialist countries, especially with Vietnamese, Koreans, and Soviets. And I can assure you that the Soviet Komsomol delegation I talked with were in quite a lot of cases very racist. The way they were looking at Chinese and at yellows was not only based on the ideological conflict with the Chinese Communist Party, which, what I can understand, they had an ideological conflict, and when you have ideological conflict, you use Marxism the way you want to legitimize your policy. But that was the appearance. But when you talked with Soviet, let's say, youth leaders, but I suppose they were telling the same things as their party leaders, in privately, they were completely racist. They were, looking at yellow people, black people. They are underdeveloped. We are civilized. We are Europeans. We should develop contact with developed civilized country of the West, even if they are capitalists. But at least at civilized nations, other nations are not civilized, and so on and so on. And it was not only against Chinese; it was also against black, against Arabs, against people, and I was really shocked by their behaviors, because I heard things I would suppose Ku Klux Klan in the United States would have said, and they were officials from the Komsomol, and after publicly they told something completely different, but in private they told that, and even if the situation at that time was already the Vietnamese communists were not in good relation with Chinese. It is very interesting. At the beginning of the 70s, when I arrived in Poland, the Vietnamese communists were still strongly with China. And still in 1973, 74, they were strongly with China, and they were considering that Soviet Union and Poland, they are revisionistic countries, but of course they cannot tell that officially because they need their help for the war. But little by little it changed, and they were less and less pro-Chinese. And at the end of the 70s, they were already criticizing China much more than at the beginning, because of Cambodia, among other things, but mostly because of Cambodia, and the Khmer Rouge and so on. But in spite of that, they always considered that Soviet Union was a great example at the time of Lenin and Stalin. But still, after Stalin, Soviet Union was going the wrong way, and Russian chauvinism is taking the lead inside the Soviet Party, and the way they look at Asian is not an internationalistic one, but in fact they understood that they need Soviet help, but Soviet Union is less and less communist.
Oh, You shocked me in this history about racism in the
Oh,
Soviet
I
Council.
was shocked. I was shocked. I have an anecdote. I will tell you. It's very funny because I told with these Soviet people about they are wrong and they cannot have this point of view and so on and so on. So they labeled me as a Maoist. And but still we were very good friends because apart from that they were good people. And I remember maybe it was in 1976 or in 1977, I don't remember exactly, one of my Soviet friends come at my student's room and he told me, you know what happened to me? I'm arriving from Moscow to Warsaw. I sit in the plane and I had two Chinese diplomats with me on the same plane because they were coming from Peking to Moscow and from Moscow to Warsaw because they were employee of the Chinese embassy. And he told me, we talked and they are normal human beings. They are not fanatics. We can talk about everything, not only politics. And, they are feeling like us. And I say, that's why I told you all the time. I mean, they're human beings. And you know what happened? When they arrived in Warsaw, they have a special queue for diplomats, but they didn't know that. So I had the long queue for normal people, and I told them, don't make the queue with me. I show you, you have a queue, very short queue for the diplomats. And when I went there, I'm showing them helping them to go there. All the Soviet group from the plane were telling me, oh, you are a traitor, you are coming with the Chinese and so on. And say, well, the Russian can be racist. I discovered that. And he was really shocked, and it was for me. I mean, he was supposed to be taught by the Komsomol that internationalism, fraternity, brotherhood, and so on is important, but it was not really the case on that field. I must assure you. That the East Germans were much more tough ideologically than the Soviet, and they were even much tougher against China ideologically. But I must recognize that the FDJ, I mean the German, the East German, political organization of the youth was not at all racist. They were anti-racist, and always when they were criticizing China in private or publicly, but especially in private, they were always saying, yeah, but the Chinese nation is our brother. We are against Maoism, but Chinese is a great nation. We respect them, and they are a great nation, and so on and so on. And the East Germans were really better than Soviet when we were talking about Chinese, because they had their ideological point of view, but they were trained because of Nazism that every racist point of view is unacceptable. And I would say that even the Poles, they were much more open-minded to China. No, I'm not talking about ideology now, but I mean when I talked about China to Polish student organization or party leaders at the time, they were telling, we have to be on the side of Soviet Union, but basically. The Soviets are not always right, and the Chinese are not always wrong. The Soviets were quite not all, of course, but it was difficult to have a rational discussion with them in the 70s about China, a rational discussion. I mean, not a discussion, a discussion showing that, in China you have contradiction, you can support this or you can support that, but it's a normal nation with a normal human behaviors as every people of the world. And there was something like a racism in Soviet Union, not only against Chinese. I observed it when they were talking with Arabs or with Africans. They were quite looking at them, there was something like a big Russian chauvinism inside Soviet Union. It was not official, but it was existing, and it was what is very very sad. It was existing inside the party organization, and it was one of the aspects of the decay of Soviet Union. It didn't appear suddenly because Yeltsin decided to take power. The ideological disintegration of internationalism was going on in Soviet Union from 50s, 60s, 70s.
Okay, I will read one comment from chat. By the way, Bruno, did you sign the manifesto in the end? I was watching your speech at the launch of true pluripolarity to socialism. What do you think about this?
I signed it, and after I cut and I resigned from signing because it's a complicated explication.
But we will speak about this after this conversation.
In English?
In Polish. This guy who asked question, he's Pole.
So he's Polish.
So he'll wait.
I will explain that in Polish. Okay. So go on.
And there is also the question about GDR, but firstly, I will ask my question. So when we have the imperialist propaganda toward Poles in the time of the Polish Republic, and the Radio Free Europe, they have two kinds of arguments. One kind of argument, it is the socialism is the poverty, is not working, and second argument is the patriotic or nationalist argument to make conflict the Polish people against the Soviet.
Yes.
I don't have the statistic, but I think that if we compare the Polish population with the Polish United Workers' Party, we can say that the leaders of the party was their relations, what they thinking about the Soviet Union was different than the most of the Polish population. That the Polish population was more anti-Soviet than the Polish parties. And officially, yes. And how it was in China, that if the population of China in 1916 and 1970s was there was this nationalist hysteria against Soviet Union, or it was only the question of the leaders of the party?
It's difficult to say, because I was not in China. And it was difficult time at that time in China. And the Chinese with whom I spoke were mostly, diplomats, and they were using very diplomatic style. So they were telling that Soviet Union is bad because it's social imperialistic and so on and so on. But we love the Soviet people. We have brotherly relation to them, and we would like them to take back the real socialism and so on and so on. And I suppose that within the Chinese society, the situation was not exactly the same because, first of all, there is something like Chinese nationalism. That's obvious. And also, Russia traditionally was one of the countries that took part in the aggression against China in the 19th century. And on that side, of course, the Chinese official communist propaganda was not wrong when they were telling that China was under English, Portuguese, French, German, Japanese, etc., occupation. But at the same time, Russia took Chinese land. And the official propaganda of that time was that Soviet Union have the land Russia, Tsarist Russia, stole from the Chinese people, that China recognized that now this land is peopled by Russian, and China doesn't want it back. But China wants the Soviet Union to recognize that these land were stolen from the Chinese people earlier. But I think that quite a lot of Chinese people at that time, and maybe today again, I don't know, think that, Vladivostok is supposed to be a Chinese city. The name of Vladivostok in Chinese is Poli. It was a little Chinese city before the Russian occupation, and in Chinese maps, sometimes you see. You don't see Vladivostok, you see Poli, you don't see Khabarovsk, you see Huangchangwei, which is the Chinese name of the city before the Russian Tsarist occupation. So I'm not sure that even now Chinese do not think that someday they will take back these lands. I know that quite a lot of Russians fear that. But as I told you, I'm not sure. I don't really know, because to know you have to make inquiry, and I cannot do these inquiries. So to be honest, I cannot tell you what is the real situation. You have to ask specialists of that. But of course, during the Cultural Revolution, which was supposed to be a pure radical left, Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, Stalinist, and whatever you want revolution, you had some aspects of nationalism, because the radical anti-imperialist slogan you had against different countries, different states, were sometimes, it could also lead to nationalism. You had huge anti-Soviet manifestation in Peking at that time. Of course, they were criticizing officially the new czars, as they were saying, but I guess that quite a lot of people of grassroots, let's say Chinese people, were to a certain extent, I guess, anti-Russian rather than anti-so-called Soviet social imperialism. But of course, I cannot be sure. What I know when I talked with Vietnamese at that time, or with Vietnamese now, is that they consider quite often that nationalism exists in Vietnam, in China, in Russia, and that nationalism created quite a lot of problems inside all communist parties, including the Vietnamese one. That's what I had, conversation with Vietnamese communists, telling me, ideologically I'm Marxist-Leninist, but I must recognize that Marxism and Leninism didn't destroy nationalism in any of socialist country. That still nationalism exists here or there, and that's why I like with Vietnamese, because Vietnamese recognize that privately, not publicly, but they recognize privately that they have Chinese nationalism, that they have Russian nationalism, but that they have also Vietnamese nationalism. And that at least that's honest.
Okay, I will ask you about the crisis of the so-called Stalinist period. That in Poland we have the example of the Światło, who was the officer who flew to the Germany and started to speak about
but his work.
And also we have example of Drweski, who
Yeah.
also was in emigration, and
Yeah.
make a lot of secrets about the Soviet Union. And these things was provoked this history of światło. Many historians said that it was very important for the change which was taking
In
place
Poland, yeah.
in Poland. And this political change which was in 1970s in China, from the radical line of the Cultural Revolution to the line of the Deng Xiaoping. Did they have the guy like światło?
It's not exactly the same situation because światło was something that happened inside the party apparatus, inside the direction, and you had different people with different orientations, and they were all competing, and at one end some escape and some didn't, but it was an internal question, an international issue inside the, let's say, higher state apparatus. China was a completely different situation because we can say that the Cultural Revolution was something like a civil war. It was a civil war between communists, but not only inside the party apparatus, but in all the society. I mean, every Chinese took part in the Cultural Revolution. On one side, on the other, of course, all of them were supposed to be communist. All of them were supposed to be Maoist, but they were fighting each other because you had the stronger Maoists, the weaker Maoists, the more extremist Maoists, the less extremist. But so inside the same ideology, you had different factions who fought each other, even to the death. So the situation is quite different because we must take it to account. It was not an international and only an internal tension inside the party, but it was a civil war atmosphere for all Chinese, and all Chinese took part in that, more or less, of course, but it was impossible at that time not to take part. Because, in every factory, in every village, you had people taking part on that side, and they pushed you. You are on our side or you're not on our side. So you were on their side, you were fighting with them, and you were not on their side, you were fighting with the other ones. So, the situation was complicated. And was even more complicated that you had not only two sides, but sometimes you had three, four. You had so many factions of the Red Guards, of the army, and so on, that it was very difficult to understand which faction represent which policy and which direction. Now we know more or less, but. In fact, what saved China is the army, because Cultural Revolution was not introduced inside the army, so the army as a structure was still disciplined. And due to the army, the restoration of unity was forced in 1978, 1979, which created the Lin Piao plot, because Lin Piao was the chief of the army, and then he thought that he was the man that can lead the country. And then you had a rectification, which was carried on by two groups, let's say the right wing of the party, with Zhou Enlai and later Deng Xiaoping, allied with the left wing of the party with Jiang Qing and ultra-Maoist against Lin Piao. And they cooperated more or less between, let's say, 1971 and 1976. And in 1976, both factions clashed. And of course, as we know, the Deng Xiaoping one won. And all of what I told you about, it's not linked only with, factional split inside the party. It's linked, with a political view. It was an ideological war. I mean, people taking side inside the Chinese Revolution, they were taking side because of political reason, because of class reason, because of economical reason. It was a real political fight. It was not only a question, I want the power, I will go with this because I want to have a careerist plan. It was a real civil war with putting the question how socialism has to be built, quickly or not, radically or not. And I would say up till now, Chinese society is to a certain extent divided again on this line. Of course, much less radically than earlier. But when Western press medias are telling that Xi Jinping is a new Red Guard, of course it's not true, but there is something in it. I mean, Xi Jinping is on the left of, let's say, Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, who was the leader of the party at that time. I would say that Xi Jinping now is in the center between the former ultra-Maoist and the former Deng Xiaoping. He's in the middle of the road because in China you have strong division about how the society has to evolve. China is a very pluralistic society, in fact, but the Communist Party of China is very pluralistic, with a very different school of thought and orientations. Just that what the Communist Party managed to organize is that even at the moment of great tensions like the Cultural Revolution, the national unity was maintained all the time, and up till now, the question of national unity is I would say the strong argument of all Communist Party members. They managed to compete, not destroying the national unity and of the state and the party, basically, in spite of all that.
Okay, now I would ask you about this third world theory. And firstly, if I am not mistaken, from the perspective of this theory, which is famous, it was in the 1950s after the Bandung Conference.
Yes, but it was not not the third world theory that the China.
Yes, and could you present this third world theory in the Bandung and compare this with the theory of Chinese? Because what did you say is from my perspective, it is not a Marxist analysis; it is a geopolitical analysis.
Of course.
For example, the South Africa was a third world country, or
no. Even at the worst moment, South Africa under apartheid was considered by China as an imperialist tool. But the question was in Angola or in Mozambique or in different countries surrounding South Africa, on which side you have to stand. But of course, the third world country, we have to, of course, Bandung, we can say indirectly, but still is the result of the Baku Congress in 1920. The Congress of the Eastern nation, of the Oriental nation, thank you. And it was at that time Lenin began to develop the theory that colonial nations are fighting for their independence, and as such, the national bourgeoisie in the third world countries are much more progressive than some, let's say, revisionist socialists in the Western world. And you had an article of Stalin at that time, which is very interesting because in those days it's very actual, who declared that the emir of Afghanistan of the time is much more progressive than the Western social democrats, because at least he's fighting for the independence of his country, for the sovereignty of his country, and he's also fighting for the economical progress of his country. When the Western social democrats are fighting for wars, the First World Wars, and the plundering of colonial nations. So at that time, of course, appeared the theory that what will be called later the Third World, at that time it was rather called the Oriental nations or the colonial nations, were the forefront of progress, because the fight of proletariat has to be united with the fight of nation. And at the time, the Comintern decided to change the motto of the working class movement, who, you know, it's proletarians of all the world unite, and Lenin pushed proletarians and oppressed people and nation of the world unite. And that's the very beginning of what will lead to the Bandung Declaration. It means that there should be an alliance of working class, but also peasant, but also a national bourgeoisie that has to be, that is objectively a rather progressive force, because they tend to develop the productive forces of their country, competing with imperialist countries, and national bourgeoisies in the colonial countries are not imperialistic, but are submitted and are fighting against imperialism. And at the time appeared this theory, because when the socialist camp developed, you had the first world, which was West, imperialist with the United States. The second war was the developing socialist country under Soviet leadership. And you had the third world. It means all these countries which were fighting for independence and decolonization, and which were not really on the eastern or on the western side, because you had differences here and there, depending, of course, which government is in which country. But the idea that third world is something coherent was, of course, related to the idea of the French Revolution, where you had the third state, which was the forefront of the revolution. So, you know, the ideology that third world is now the forefront of the world revolution, as the third state was the forefront of the revolution inside the French Revolution, was something, you know, the 2 times they were using the word third and the number third, and the third was something symbolic. And of course, it has to be linked with the fact that in China, the revolution did manage to unify peasant, workers, intellectuals, and national bourgeoisie toward independence, toward new democracy, and toward socialism. And you have to remember that the flag of the Chinese People's Republic up till now has the big star, but has 4 stars, 4 little stars. And the 4 little stars, they are the peasant, the workers, the petit bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. The unity of these four class under the big star, which is the leading revolution. That's the official flag of the People's Republic of China, and that's the ideology on which Chinese People's Republic was founded. And you have another thing you have to know, is that the specificity of the Chinese Revolution, as you know, was that after having loose fight in cities, it means among working workers, most communists flew to the countryside and mobilized the peasantry toward revolution, and it led at the very end at the foundation of the Chinese People's Republic. And Mao Zedong developed then the idea, the strategical idea that countryside is surrounding cities, and that you have to first conquer the countryside, and when you have the countryside, you push inside cities. On the consequences of the third world I told you about, Maoists all over the world, but of course especially in China, developed the theory that the third world is the world countryside. And that what happened in China, the countryside, a surrounded city, it will be the same in the whole world. The countryside, it means the third world, will surround the city-states, which are, of course, the imperialist states. At the very beginning of this theory, of course, the idea was that the countryside is the third world and the city is mainly West imperialism. But at the end of the theory was that the countryside is still the third world, but the center of imperialism are in Washington and Moscow, because Soviet Union became so-called social imperialist. But all the time, third world was this ideology that makes that the theory was that the Chinese theory you have in the Chinese-American communique in 1971 when Nixon was in Peking, the Chinese put this sentence in the communique: the Chinese government think that people want revolution, nation want liberation, and state wants independence. So that it means what? It means this theory that there is a class war. It means working class want revolution and tend to the revolution, but nation, it means working class plus national bourgeoisie, wants liberation. It means want to have the liberation of their occupied by imperialist country. And state, it means when a state exists, the local, let's say, state bureaucracy is tending to want to fight for independence. So it means that even if you have a reactionary government in third world country, earlier or later, this government will try to be more independent from imperialism. Of course, you have example that shows that it can be right, but you have example that shows that it can be false. It can be right. I mean, Saddam Hussein arrived at the power under the protection of the American, as you know. And he rebelled against United States. Bin Laden or the Taliban were created under the protection of imperialists, and as you know, they rebelled. How they rebelled, it's another question, but anyway, they rebelled against imperialism. But you have also the other aspect of the thing. The Chinese didn't really took into account. You had Nasser, who put his country more and more on the progressive way, and then you had the Egyptian bureaucracy with Sadat that took back his country in the imperialist camp. So you can have on one side, but you can have of the other side. So the idea that if you have a dependent under imperialism a state, this state will tend toward independence. It's very hazardous. Sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. And in the 70s, the Chinese did quite a lot of errors on that field, because sometimes they supported states which were going progressive way, but sometimes they did support states which were not at all going the progressive way, and on the contrary were going more and more reactionary, in spite of the fact that they were third world countries and third world states. So, the theory of of this three world. First of all, when you write the book that was published in China in the 70s, as I told you, there is 2 sentences of Mao Zedong, and all the rest is written by Chinese diplomats who take out of these 2 sentences a whole theory, which was not really Mao Zedong's theory, but which was the diplomatic school of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs of that time. And the experience of history showed that sometimes they were right, but quite a lot of time they were wrong. And it pushed China to take positions in Ethiopia, in Angola, in Mozambique, which were obviously counter-revolutionary at the very end. The best answer I can give is that Chinese medias at the time in the 70s were describing Cuba as a tool of Soviet social imperialism, especially in Africa. And Cuba was denounced by Chinese medias in a very, very radical way. Now Chinese accept that they were wrong, in fact, because they recognize that Cuba made a very progressive policy in Africa. And of course, they will not tell this very clearly, but in fact, they recognize that Cuba was much more progressive at that time than China. If they recognize that China was right, that Cuba was right in Angola, it means China was not right. That's that you have to take the side. And I mean, when they say Cuba had a positive role, it means China had a negative one.
And could you say something about this theory that Soviet Union was the imperialist state? Because the imperialist is the higher state of the capitalism, and with the special role of the financial capital.
That's a very important point. And even the Chinese at the time, they changed their mind. They changed their vocabulary, because in the 70s, they were using this argument of social imperialism. And step by step, they changed it. They still had very bad relation with Soviet Union, but they used less and less the word social imperialism, and they introduced a new one, which was hegemony. That Soviet Union was a hegemonic power. And hegemony is not a scientific category, but anyway, it's not imperialism. So it means that step by step, and it would be very interesting. I cannot tell you about that, nothing, because I don't know. But it would be interesting to analyze what was observed by the Chinese so that they changed their vocabulary. Because this change is not neutral. I mean, they understood at a certain point that whatever the relation with Soviet Union was not an imperialist country. You could say it's a hegemonic country, but hegemonic is something difficult to precise exactly in a scientific way.
It's
But
from
of course,
Gramsci, I think, this
yes,
word.
but Gramsci is talking about cultural hegemony. He's not talking about imperialism or hegemony of a superpower, like as a at the time of Gramsci there was imperialism and there was Soviet Union, which was not. So it was not the same situation. And he used the word hegemony to characterize the cultural situation of societies which were influenced either by the cultural hegemony of the bourgeoisie or the cultural hegemony of the proletariat. But Chinese used the word hegemony in completely different way. They wanted to show that Soviet Union is a hegemonic country, which means, in fact, it's not a real imperialist country. But what it is difficult to say. I mean, we all know. I mean, we have to be rational and objective. We all know that in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, not only the nation, the people, but party members, party leaders were always considering that the Soviet brothers are a little bit hegemonic toward them. And that they don't really behave the way pure internationalists should do, because they are pushing decisions, because they are stronger than, let's say, Hungarian direction or Bulgarian direction. And, there is something like a Soviet hegemony, and there is inside Soviet hegemony something like a Russian, let's say, ethnocentrism or nationalism. And it was clear for everybody. I mean, you could talk with Gierek, with Gomułka, with Huszak, with Dubček, with Kadar, with Rakosi, and so on, and they all privately would have told you, the Soviets sometimes they are a little bit too heavy for us. So there was something like a hegemony. But the problem is to define it, and it's complicated. But what is important to come back for China is that the Chinese, when they ceased to use the word, the expression social imperialism, they understood that basically you can criticize Soviet Union for a lot of reasons, but it's not an imperialist country, because there is no bourgeoisie having financial control over world finances. I mean, the Soviet ruble was not the dollar. I mean, it had no value outside Soviet Union. So, I mean, you had no tool of Soviet imperialism. So you had no Soviet imperialism. You had something like a hegemony, a political hegemony of Soviet Union. Maybe we can discuss about that, but it was not an economical hegemony. The same thing, we can criticize some economical decision taken by Soviet Union in relation with other socialist countries. But we have to take into account that basically Soviet Union was paying quite a lot to maintain the so-called socialist community, what the imperialists would never do. I mean, the imperialists, they don't pay the political friendship. They just plunder countries all over the world. The Soviet Union didn't plunder countries. I mean, they had good or bad decisions, but you cannot tell that Soviet Union was plundering a country all over the socialist period. You can criticize one moment, one decision, one aspect at a certain moment, but globally, if you look at how the socialist function from the very beginning to the end in 1989, you will see that basically Soviet Union paid for the socialist camp. And if you look at the Soviet system inside Soviet Union, you will look that Russia paid for the development of Central Asia, of Caucasus, and so on. So it was not a colonial system. It was not an imperialistic system. You can say it was a hegemonic system, but then we have to study and to think about what it means, hegemony. But for sure, the Soviet Union was not, to the very end, imperialistic. It doesn't mean that some Russian would not like to be imperialistic. It just means that the Soviet Union had not the tool to be imperialistic. It couldn't be imperialistic for purely economical and social reason. And that explains also why Russia today is a pure capitalistic country, that's for sure. But it is not an imperialistic country. We can, of course, criticize this decision of Putin or that decision of Putin, but still, even if the Russian oligarchy today is rich and strong in Russia, this oligarchy has not the power to make out of Russia a new United States. Maybe they would like to, but they can't, because the balance of power in the world make them lower than the central, let's say, imperialist bourgeoisie. So even the capitalist Russia now is a exploiting class society, is a country which carries on a lot of policy we can like or not, or dislike, but we cannot tell Russia is an imperialist country, even now being capitalistic. So at the time of Soviet Union, whatever you can criticize their decision in Afghanistan, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, it's of course a big debate, but it's not imperialist aggression. It's something else. And it has to be taken in this context. And the Chinese in the 70s made this big error. At the beginning, at least theoretical error, they thought Soviet Union was imperialistic country. Then they changed, introducing the word hegemony, because they understand something was not really, it was not a really scientific argumentation. And then at the very end, they understood that Soviet Union is disappearing. It said, and it's a bad thing for the world balance of power and for their own national interest. But it was too late anyway, because Soviet Union was disappearing. Of course, Soviet Union didn't disappear because of China. Soviet Union disappeared for a much other reason. But to a certain extent, we can say that the Chinese didn't help Soviet Union to survive. And when they discovered that Soviet Union should have survived, unfortunately, they did it too late. But they wouldn't have, they were not the cause of the disintegration of Soviet Union, but still they helped in this process.
Okay, so for the Finnish question, it's something which already you said, but I will read it. Why did Honecker attempt to get Chinese help in saving GDR fail? Did China refuse? And if so, why?
No, China, problem with German Democratic Republic is that I guess the East German leadership understood very late, too late, that what was happening in Eastern Europe and especially in Soviet Union was leading socialism to collapse. I don't know what should have been done and if something could have been done, but anyway, at the end of 1988, beginning of 1989, Honecker, like Ceausescu in Romania, became aware that the question is the survival of socialism. Earlier, they thought that maybe there is something negative, but basically the socialist camp is sufficiently solid to survive. And at that time, they understood the real situation. And of course, they looked for ally. And if you are in East Berlin, I mean, what you can do. At the same time, at the very same time, the Chinese did understand that Soviet Union was disappearing. As I told you, the Chinese also very lately understood this situation. But they both understand. And then Honecker went to China, to North Korea, to Cuba to look for ally and to make something to help the socialism to survive, at least in his country. And of course, the Chinese, he was on the same, he was very well received by the Chinese, because the Chinese understood that they had to help German Democratic Republic to survive, but it was too late. So the Chinese, what they can do, I mean, they received Honecker in 1989. You had first the Tiananmen so-called events. In the spring of 1999, in June, you had the Polish elections. And then you had all the summer, the decaying of the socialist camp, and at the end of the year, the German Democratic Republic began to disappear. So, I mean, the Chinese, of course, they wanted to help, but it was too late. I mean, what the Chinese could do to help East German. I know that Honecker, at a certain moment, was thinking that he can make in East Germany what the Chinese did at Tiananmen. He thought about that. I don't know if he talked with Chinese, how they did it in Peking and how he can do it in Berlin. But at the very end, Honecker decided not to do it in East Berlin and not to engage a strong repression of the movement because, you know, the situation was completely different. I mean, independently from the situation of East German society, you had Soviet troops in East Germany, and Gorbachev took the side against Honecker. So what could Honecker do to preserve socialism in a country where the Soviet troops were and where Gorbachev was pushing him out of the power? I mean, he was not in the situation of China. In China, you know, they decided, because China was an independent country, and there was no foreign troops, and the Chinese leadership decided to change, that Cao Ziyang was not the good general secretary, that he was a social traitor, and that a new direction of the party has to be decided that will preserve at least some aspect of the Chinese socialism. But I mean, in China, they had no problem with foreign intervention. They were a pure independent country. In East Germany, in German Democratic Republic, Honecker could not really do something because he knew that Gorbachev and his Soviet troops were on the side of the counter-revolution. So he tried, but he couldn't. Like Ceausescu tried also. Ceausescu even tried not only to get the support of the Chinese, but he even tried to have the support of the Iranians, which were not really, as you know, communists, but still were revolutionaries. And but what the Iran could do to preserve Ceausescu power in Romania? I mean, it was too late anyway.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. So we will continue in 5 minutes in Polish language.
Okay.
All viewers here, I invite you to kanał Odrodzenie Komunizmu. We will speak about the manifest, the true pluripolarity to socialism.
Oh yeah.
Dobra.